Now, picking up where my previous lecture had left off, we're at the United States-Mexican War. For Abraham Lincoln, he is on a high, a political high, been elected to the United States Congress, but everything is going to go south once Lincoln gets to Washington, because Lincoln, coming in the midst of a national war, a popular war, a war in which Americans desperately want to win, to claim Mexico, to claim the possessions out west, Lincoln's going to go against the grain and ruffle a lot of feathers, namely the majority of the American people who support the war. Now, real quick, the war had gone, from the American perspective, wonderful. It was an easy victory.
It all started basically pushing United States troops down to where the United States claimed was Texas's southern border, the Rio Grande, and prompting the Mexicans to defend what they believed was rightfully their territory, giving Polk reason after the Mexicans fired on the U.S., killing Americans on what Polk said was American soil, was able to get a declaration of war. And the war went perfect from the American standpoint. Easy. Largely bloodless war from the Americans because they had better soldiers, better equipment. Most of the deaths are a result of disease. Americans contracting diseases, they had no immunity for in regions Americans hadn't previously been. War wrapped up in late 1847, September, with the Americans claiming Mexico City, and the war, there'll be a peace treaty in February 1848. But for the purpose of this class, let's get to Abraham Lincoln, because when Abraham Lincoln comes into Washington, he's ready to score political points. He wants to make a name for himself as a junior congressman, freshman, as an incoming freshman congressman, or we would call a junior understudy. He immediately attacks President Polk. He issues what is known as his spot resolutions, and in a nutshell, what it is he basically called out the president and asked him to show him on a map the spot in which the American soldiers had been killed on American soil, as the president claimed. Well, President Polk didn't walk down to Congress and point on a map. The Democratic Party answered. And they said, look, it was here, north of the Rio Grande. That's on American soil. Lincoln disputed that. He said, look at this, look at the map. The Mexicans never claimed that territory was for you all. After Texas's independence, there was a dispute over where was the southern border of Texas. The Mexicans said it was north of that, the Nueces River. The Americans said, no, it's the Rio Grande. And what Lincoln argued was, look, this slither of land was disputed, and largely no Americans were living in that area after the Texas Revolution and leading up to this war. That basically, Mr. President, you pushed those troops down there to provoke the Mexicans, who you knew were going to defend what they claimed to be their territory, and they would fire upon American soil, giving you the just cause to call for a declaration of war. Look, Lincoln's trying to score points with his party. This backfires completely. The reason is, this is a popular war. The Americans want it. The Americans want that territory to the west. It's so popular, Americans volunteer in large numbers. Tennessee gets its nickname from the volunteers for its participation in not only this war, but earlier in the War of 1812. Tennessee is often noted for its eagerness of its citizens to fight for their country, but also the second most populous state in sending troops to fight in the Mexican-American War was Illinois. And in Illinois, the Democratic Party controlled the state, especially in the northern and southern portions of the state. Democratic control. Therefore, the people of Illinois were for the war.
the people of Illinois tended to be pro-Democratic majority and supported their Democratic president. They looked upon Abraham Lincoln
as being against this war. That Lincoln was trying to hold up a bill with his spot resolutions, which was an appropriations bill to help fund the war. The argument was being made that Lincoln's trying to score political points, holding up a bill to get necessary funding for the U.S. troops, that Lincoln is basically, I'm putting words in their mouths, but kind of anti-American. This backfires on him. William Herndon sends him a letter. William Herndon, his junior law partner, sends him a letter saying, basically, the people back home aren't happy with you. And Lincoln writes a letter on February 1st, 1848. This is a letter you're responsible for, a document in which Lincoln basically says this little excerpt. If you misunderstand, I fear other good friends will also. The significance of this letter was Lincoln realized that the people back home in Illinois were not happy with him. That his actions, his impetuousness, his desire to score political points, to better his political career, to advance it, had backfired. He shot too high in taking on the president, a popular president during a popular war. And he knew now that if his own friends misunderstood what he was doing, like William Herndon was concerned, then he feared everyone else will also. And this was sort of a wake-up moment that, the people back in Illinois are not going to be happy with me, and they aren't. Lincoln's handwriting is on the wall. You're not going to be reelected. If you had thoughts on a second term, it's done. You're not getting elected. So Lincoln basically goes back to Illinois after having served one term. His political career is derailed from 1849 until 1854, which will be the break in this course time-wise for the midterm, and then from the midterm to the final. This period, Lincoln is depressed. His melancholy returns, and he comes back to Springfield disappointed. In conversations with Herndon in their law office, he just would say how hard it is to die and leave one's country no better than if one had never lived. He was making these sort of statements like, I've done nothing in my life. I'm going to die and have achieved nothing. On the positive side, even though his political career was derailed, he went back home to Springfield and threw himself as a distraction into his work. And as a result, he made a lot of money as a lawyer. A lot of money. It's in this period he is clearly out of the red. His national debt is erased. And over these 5-6 years, Lincoln becomes one of the wealthiest people in Springfield, Illinois. Another thing, when he came back, he looked over their law books while he had been in Washington, looked at what Herndon had done, and Herndon expected him and Lincoln would look at it, and they'd split the fees, according to the Lincoln-Herndon law firm, 50-50. When Lincoln looked at it, he said, look, you did this on your own. I wasn't here. You did 100% of the work, so you get to keep 100% of the fees. And Herndon got to collect it all. Another reason that they work so well together, it really is a equal partnership. Even though Lincoln's name is in front, he's considered the senior partner, and by experience, Herndon really has a joint equal footing with Lincoln. Now, if disappointment with political office is not enough, and remember, Lincoln is so gung-ho about politics, it drives him. He's hurt. He's crushed. There's family tragedies coming, which are just going to pile on to the depression he's feeling. And don't forget about Mary. Mary's dealing with it as well. As the wife of Lincoln, she feels these setbacks significantly because she is driven by politics too. But the family tragedies begin to hit, and they start on Mary's side. Her father, Robert Todd, was
decided he wanted to get involved in Kentucky politics, and he began actively campaigning for for the Senate seat, the state Senate seat in Kentucky. And during the summer of 1849, while out on the campaign trail, he contracted cholera and died. Cholera was a widespread epidemic in not only Kentucky during 1849, but also in Knoxville, Tennessee. He dies. Now she loses her dad, and she was very close to her father. She's a daddy's girl. On the heels of that, in the winter of 1849-1850, she loses her grandma. Now, Grandma Parker had lived a long life, and it was her time, but it comes on the heels of losing her father. And that stings. But the worst is yet to come. Because at the very moment she was dealing with the loss of her father and her grandmother, their second-born child, Eddie, becomes ill.
At age 3.5, he fell ill. Mary tried her best to nurse him, but the medical practice of the day could do little to combat what was likely pulmonary tuberculosis. After 52 days of suffering with fevers, sweating, chest pain, weight loss, coughing up blood, young Eddie's body couldn't fight any longer. And he died on February 1st, 1850, just days shy of his 4th birthday. The loss was significant. Lincoln wrote a letter to his stepbrother, John Johnston, mentioning it. We miss him so much. Depression, sadness, Mary, uncontrollable, crying. It was a tough time. And to make it worse, Lincoln still rode the circuit at this time, going out, hearing cases for like 3 months at a time, from courthouse to courthouse. And during this process, now granted, he'll be home when Eddie dies, but he's gone like 150 days a year during this period. That's hard as they're dealing with this loss. For Lincoln, it's a way that he always throws himself into his business or work, anything he can do. But for Mary, this is doubly, it's just hurtful and painful, and she doesn't have, at times, Lincoln to deal with it. Because this isn't something that just goes away after a week or so. When Lincoln hits the road, months later, the sadness hits, and it Eddie's in her memories every day of her life. I'm for sure of that. There's another loss. Now, this one, not to be rude or anything or crude about it, but maybe not as much as losing Eddie. But Abraham Lincoln receives word that his father's grown ill from that brother, John Johnston. And Thomas becomes ill in late 1850. And he's writing through John Johnston, asking Lincoln to please come see me. Lincoln is still living, in Illinois where Lincoln had left him in 1831 when he went to New Salem. It's not too far away. They're in the same state. Maybe a couple days ride. But he doesn't go see him. Even though he's begging to come see him. Lincoln writes a letter on January 12th, 1851. It's a farewell letter to his dad. It's addressed to John Johnston, because John Johnston's literate, and will read it to his stepdad, Thomas. Lincoln says to John to say to Thomas, "Tell him to remember to call upon and confide in our great and good and merciful Maker, who will not turn away from him in any extremity. He will not forget the dying man who puts his trust in him. Say to him that if we could meet now, it is doubtful whether it would be not more painful than pleasant." When Lincoln walked away from his father in 1831, he walked away from his father for good.
he would never see him face to face again. And 5 days after sending that letter, probably a day or two after they received the letter, Thomas died on January 17, 1851. Lincoln would eventually go back to the farm about a year later when Thomas was dead and buried to go see his stepmom, his best friend, as he called her, his stepbrother, and the extended family. That's a lot of loss in a period of a year and a half. Not to mention the loss of the political career for Lincoln. It was tough. But interestingly, how people dealt with loss in the 19th century, especially on the frontier where it was more commonplace, it could break up a husband and wife, but it could also bring them together closer. And in a sense, even though Lincoln is gone out riding the circuit for like almost half a year, they do work to replace the loss of Eddie with more children. And shortly after Eddie's death, on December 21st, 1850, comes their third child, William Wallace Lincoln. William Wallace Lincoln, otherwise known as Willie, named after Mary's brother-in-law, Dr. William Wallace. Still, third child down, no one named Thomas. But finally, to give Willie a playmate, in 1853, on April 4th, Thomas Tad Lincoln is born. And this is the first child born after Thomas's death. He names this child Thomas, after his father finally. But rather than a name like Tommy or something that goes as a nickname, they named him Tad. And that's because this will be the last child Mary will be able to bear. Because during the pregnancy, there were significant complications. And during delivery, pushing out Tad was difficult. And when he came out, Tad's head was sort of a little misshaped in a sense. It wasn't a perfect ball or round circle, so to speak. When Lincoln looked at him, he looked down and he said, "Oh my gosh, looks kind of like a tadpole. I'm going to call him Tad." Well, Mary wasn't happy. She wasn't thrilled. It was a grueling delivery for her, and she wasn't happy with the complications and the realization this will be her last child. She will never refer to Thomas as Tad. It's Thomas. Lincoln loves nicknames, and he's Tad in Lincoln's eyes. A little bit of joy here now with these two children. And I will say, a different father will start to be born in Lincoln, because up to this point, Lincoln is very distant with the oldest child, Robbie. And it was distance because he was always focused on his political career. And that'll have implications in the future. There's not going to be a good relationship between Lincoln and Robbie. But with the young boys and Lincoln's home in Springfield, even though he will eventually come back to politics, Lincoln does a much better job in relating to these two kids, and they have a closer relationship. Also, they're going to get free reign, because Lincoln and Mary are going to be kind of hands-off. They're not disciplinarians. Lincoln once said, when criticized about his parenting skill, not disciplining, he said, "Look, I'm not going to inflict any parental terrorism on my children." Parental tyranny, he would often say. Wasn't seeking to come down hard on them, as he had endeared with his father. There is one last person I got to introduce, Reverend James Smith. And he is an important figure in helping the Lincolns cope with their grief. He was a minister in Springfield, a Presbyterian minister of the First Presbyterian Church. And following Ed's death, Mary and Lincoln reached out. He began to offer pastoral care and comfort for Lincolns. He'd frequently visit the Lincoln's house late in the evening and be there for Mary and Abe. And then when Mary would go to bed, him and Abraham Lincoln would stay up, and often into the wee hours of the morning. And Lincoln and him were talking on deep level, because not just about dealing with loss and grief, but he was also there to talk to Lincoln about religion. And Lincoln, sort of a deist in the sense that he doesn't join a Christian church, much like our founding fathers, deists, who believe in a higher power, but not so much the miracles, because the miracles can't be explained by science and reasoning, sort of coming out of the Enlightenment era. And Reverend Smith had been a deist as a young man himself. Now, he had converted and joined, became a Christian, but early in his life he had doubts as an educated man. And so he could have these conversations with Lincoln because they could relate. And Lincoln enjoyed these conversations. Now, Reverend Smith never gets Lincoln to join a Christian church, become a Christian in the sense of placing membership in a Christian church, but he does get Lincoln to start attending church regularly. And after the loss of Eddie, Lincoln and Mary begin to regularly attend the church of Reverend Smith. Matter of fact, Mary, who had been an Episcopalian, Lincoln had raised in a Baptist family, they started attending the Presbyterian church. Mary even joins the Presbyterian church. Lincoln begins to attend more regularly. That's a first for him. Eventually,
Will send him to Washington, but it could have possibly maybe continued. It's counterfactual. It's maybe, but maybe he could have eventually joined the church. He was regularly attending up until his president election in 1860. Conclusions up to this point. For Lincoln, it's been a difficult life. From the lost loved ones, a brother, a mother, a sister, a loved one in Anne Rutledge, his father through the physical and verbal abuse. It's a difficult life. It's amazing for what he achieved. When he finally, after self-educating himself as a young man, when he finally left and went to New Salem and Springfield, these were new opportunities, new friends that came into his life, people that helped advance his career, and because he had the initiative. He had some trouble with the women, engagements, marriage, finally got off with Mary Todd and began a family. Not a happy storybook type marriage. It was hot and cold. There was moments of wedding bliss, and then there was moments of Mary chasing Lincoln out the front door with a stick. He achieved his political highs in the Illinois State House, but then had a falling out when he, after his major achievement of the $10 million internal improvement bill passed, when the National Depression swept across Illinois, he was blamed. It had a minor setback, but then the door opened to national office, and he got elected to U.S. Congress. But then again, his aspirations, his political ambitions bit him in the butt when he aimed too high and took on the president, and his political career was derailed. Everything seemed to be going downhill for Lincoln. The personal tragedies, and he'll be out of politics from 1849 to 1854. Nothing. But then the winds will shift in his favor when an issue which has been divisive for a long time in this country begins to creep up and become even more divisive as it becomes the most divisive issue in the 1850s. That is slavery. That's what will bring him back. And that's what we'll start with when we get on the other side of the midterm, as Lincoln rises for the presidency. Next week is the midterm. I wish everyone the best of luck. Remember again, it is 3 parts. First part is multiple choice. True, false could be mixed in there as well. It's all, the answers are there. You just have to match it. These will be questions based upon randomly generated, but usually getting at the significance of it could be a person, even though people are in part 2. It could be people in part 1 as well. Could be significant events in Lincoln's life. Part 2 is the ID. Clearly, names match it up. And part 3 is the documents. Know the significance of those documents. I'm not going to ask you what the date was, but you'll have to know
Lincoln to Miss Orville Browning, Lincoln to William Herndon, Lincoln to the people of Sangamon County, Lincoln answering the charges of infidelity. Who's he writing to? Who's his audience? What's his main points? What's the significance? That's what those questions, which will be multiple choice true false, will get at. I wish everyone the best of luck.